Hi again then guys, and welcome to another look back into the world of the first ride game at one of my favourite bikes in the game. Not in a real world sense. In the real world I like the bike, but it's not one of my favourites. But specifically in this game, this is one of my most used bikes. It's such a good machine to work with, especially on technical circuits, and we'll get to why in just a second. Now, the bike is actually one which I referred to inaccurately in the last episode of this series about the motorbikes, because I said that that bike handled even better than the Ducati 996, which is this bike. At least that's what I meant. Of course, it's not a 996, it's the 998, and in particular the R version, which is basically the top of the production tree. Now, with that in mind, there is a big difference. Of course, the 996, I believe, looks almost exactly the same as the 916, the 748 even looks similar with a different colour, and the 998 is basically the pinnacle of 90s Ducatis. This particular shape of Ducatis is actually my favourite that they've ever done, before or since. I love this design, I really do. It's one of my favourite vehicle designs ever, not just of Ducati. I love the simplicity of the design. It manages to be both extremely efficient looking in terms of having no clutter and just being a pure focus sport bike, but at the same time, in a similar way to the simple style of an MV Agusta, to me this is a stunning looking bike. It's very much a 90s bike, but it has aged so well. It's such a good looking machine as far as I'm concerned, and in particular, I said that we'd go back to the 748, and we will, because that is my favourite Ducati ever, and it's one of my favourite bikes ever. The Ducati 748, and in particular the SP, in yellow with the white at the back where the pillion would be. Absolutely incredible machine. Track day fantasy, basically. One of the best track-going Ducatis ever made, but less powerful than this one. Now, this bike doesn't have a huge amount of power by today's standards. It's got that 998cc V-twin, that traditional kind of thumpy rumble that Ducatis have. Sounds fantastic. I'm a big fan of the way that all Ducatis sound, but especially ones like this. And the power isn't ridiculous. It's got 139 horsepower. Even the torque, 77 pound-feet. That's less, for instance, than the Aprilia Mille of the same kind of time. So it's not a record-breaking bike in that kind of sense. But for Ducati, that was still the top of the tree pretty much at the time. And of course, it's from a different era. It's still essentially a 90s concept, but just refined and taken a bit further. Whereas now, especially from around 2006 onward, bikes started to get more powerful much more rapidly. 160, 170, 180, 200 horsepower or more. Whereas 139 then, even around 2 decades ago, which is when it was, that was powerful. Especially for a Ducati, because Ducatis don't tend to make stupidly powerful bikes. Even the top of the tree, the Desmo, that's a 200 horsepower bike. Still doesn't sound insane. But what it can do with that is insane. It's a seriously rapid bike, and we are going to review that one as well down the line. But for now, this one really is one of my go-to bikes because it's so light on its feet. The design of the bike as well is very compact, and of course that's shared from the 748 and the 900 series because they both have the same essential body shell. Now, the weight is 183 kilos, which is really good actually, even by today's standards, and the horsepower per kilo is 0.76. So it's not quite something like a Yamaha R1, but it is very good. 0.76 for a Ducati of the time is high. Now, essentially what you've got here is kind of like a MotoGP bike for the road, but when it comes to Ducati, to me at least, it always feels like that's almost more literal than with other companies. Like some companies will release like a special liveried version of a bike, maybe with stiffer forks and slightly more powerful brakes, and then call it like the factory edition, like Aprilia would. And I love that bike, don't get me wrong. But with Ducati, there's just something about them that they really do feel like a race bike for the road. Sometimes to a fault, where they're not necessarily quite as practical or as easy to live with. But in the case of this one, in the world of a game especially, it's such a good bike to work with. It's one of my most used bikes in the game, if not my most used actually, in terms of mileage. You can use it for so many events, really, where you will easily dominate bikes with far more power, because it's so fast through the corners and so easy to work with. It's a surprisingly forgiving bike. The handling is incredible. it's no slouch, that's for sure. It was the pinnacle of the time, and it's one of those bikes which, it doesn't really matter how old it is, it's always going to be competitive, and you can tell that immediately whenever you take it up against even the latest of superbikes in the game. They might have less weight, they might have way more power even. Most of them do have a lot more power, but it's still such a competitive bike, because that's the thing about a great concept. It doesn't matter how old it gets, it's still a great concept. And to me, this entire design era of Ducati, specifically for the 700 and 900 series, is pretty much a perfect superbike. Of course there are people who would disagree with that, but for me, this is definitely one of the best bikes in the game, certainly one which you should check out, and for 29,000 credits, it's actually surprisingly affordable as well. So it's definitely worth a look, and of course I'll see you guys next time, but for now, as always, thanks for watching.